The first thing Evelyn Carter learned about courage was that it felt nothing like the pamphlets said. In the leaflets the college kids ran off on a sputtering mimeograph. Courage had a posture. Back straight, chin lifted. A halo of certainty stapled to a young person's head. But when she stepped off the church steps into Birmingham's April light, courage felt like a bowl held with two hands that might spill if you breathed too hard. Stay tight. Eyes forward, Pastor Ellis said, voice a soft drum. He stood in the church doorway as if blessing a wedding procession, his white cuffs lit by the sun. The choir had finished humming "We Shall Not Be Moved," and the tune still threaded Evelyn's chest like a silver wire. They moved. Children, grandmothers in low heels, boys whose names she didn't know but already loved because of the way they held one another's jackets. Evelyn was 18, spine alight with a mixture of indignation and something like joy. She could feel her mother's gaze even from 2 blocks away. Ruthie May had refused to come, not out of fear, she'd said, but strategy. Everybody can't be front line. Somebody got to keep the rice hot. Still, when Evelyn left the house, Ruthie had pressed a brown paper bag into her palm, cornbread, an apple, and a folded piece of paper with a verse written in her mother's neat loops. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love. At the corner of 4th and 17th the world thinned. White men leaned against storefronts as if watching a parade they didn't order. A policeman's thumb rode the ridge of his belt. Somewhere a screen door slammed and a dog began to bark with the conviction of a creature that had never once been told no. Evelyn's hand brushed the hand of the boy beside her. He was taller by a head, cheekbones sharp as if cut from an old record. His sign vote is a verb, tilted slightly in his grip. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she lied, surprised at the steadiness of her voice. "I'm Zay," he said, as if offering shelter. "Isaiah Booker. You don't have to be fine to be here." The chant rose not from the front but the middle, somewhere among the kids in denim and home-sewn skirts. The words rippled forward and back. "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round." The line curved past a diner where a waitress stood with a coffee pot, motionless, like a figure in a snow globe. Zay's baritone braided with Evelyn's alto, and somewhere inside the rhythm, her fear found a seat and sat down. "Eyes forward," Pastor Ellis had said, but it was the past that kept looking at her. She saw her grandmother shelling peas on a back step, soft hands quick, saying they scare you till you small enough to fit in their pocket. "Don't you go in nobody's pocket, Evie." She saw the pitch-black mile between her father and her forever, a space where the story had chewed itself silent. She saw the kitchen table where Ruthie counted tips from the cafe and pennies from cleaning the doctor's office, her lips moving in numbers like prayers. Sirens began like a song sung by someone who didn't care for melody. 2 police cars slid up the street as if they owned the idea of roads. The first line of marchers stopped, and the whole body of the procession accordion folded to stillness. In the unscripted quiet, a blue jay landed on the traffic light and tilted its head as if reading. The officer with the belt-riding thumb stepped forward. His face had the pink sheen of a fresh burn. "This assembly is unlawful," he intoned, as if he'd invented law. "Disperse now." No one moved. Somewhere behind Evelyn a child began to cry, a tired, milk-thin sound, and an older woman's hand stroked hair. Zay glanced at Evelyn, a question without punctuation. She heard herself say, "We have a permit." The sentence tasted like a clean tooth. She had no idea if it was true, but the words built a small porch to stand on. The officer's eyes grazed her and slid off, as if the idea of her had too much friction. "Last warning," he said to the air. Pastor Ellis lifted his hand. "We will proceed peacefully," he said, so gently that for a moment it seemed reasonable, almost friendly, to obey him. They took 2 steps. The batons answered. Evelyn knew sound would fail memory, but later she would remember the slap of wood on signs, the tear in muslin, Zay's sign cracking like a wishbone. She would remember the way her elbow found Zay's rib and stayed there, as if they'd been born that way, 2 pieces of one hinge. She would remember the apple in her bag hitting the street and rolling toward the curb as if it could grow a tree by force of will alone. A hand seized her wrist, Another officer, hair the color of a paper bag, twisting with a speed that suggested practice. Pain flared white. She swallowed her voice before it could leave her, not out of pride but to keep the fear from multiplying. Zay pivoted, slipping his own forearm between baton and bone, a clumsy, valiant grace. The baton fell anyway. It found his shoulder with a blunt, wooden certainty. "Leave him!" someone shouted. "Don't you?" The sentence cut itself on blue cloth. "Hands behind your back," the first officer said. Evelyn obeyed. Not because he said so but because the narrowness of the moment demanded all her attention. Cold circled her wrists. A metal bracelet with no music in it. They were guided, pushed toward the patrol car. Zay's face had gone the color of wet slate. He wasn't trying to be brave, he simply was. "You good?" he asked again, as if there were an answer that could fit in a mouth. "Still here," she said. "Still here," he repeated. And the phrase was a thread they held between them so the crowd couldn't take them from each other. Inside the car, the smell of vinyl and old rain. A young officer in the front seat kept adjusting the mirror, as if he were trying to see the part of himself that hadn't yet decided who he was. The car door shut with the polite finality of a bank. At the station they were catalogued, name, address, the petty geography of control. A woman at a metal desk gave Evelyn a look that traveled a long way in a short time. Fatigue, pity, contempt, the quick calculation of someone who had mortgage payments and a son the same age as the girl in front of her. "Empty your pockets," she said. Evelyn offered up Ruthie's verse and a peppermint. The woman didn't take the verse, only the candy. The holding cell was a dull gray rectangle, the kind of gray that forgot how to be any other color. There were 8 of them by the time the door clanged. A choir alto whose nose bled politely into a handkerchief. 2 high school boys glancing at each other like brothers. An older man who kept touching a wedding ring as if checking whether a door was locked, Zay, and now Evelyn. No one talked for a long time. Then the alto hummed what was left of the morning's hymn, and people's shoulders lowered by the fraction a note can manage. Zay sat on the floor with his back against the wall, eyes closed, breathing a slow equation. "First time?" the older man asked Evelyn, not unkindly. "Yes," she said, surprised at the child in her voice. He nodded, as if to say, "Everything you're feeling happened to me yesterday, and will happen to someone else tomorrow." "You got somebody to call?" "My mother," she said, and the word felt like a house with the porch light on. The hours extended themselves the way hunger does, making everything louder. Lock clicks, shoes on linoleum, someone 3 cells down asking for water, a clerk saying there wasn't any more paper for forms. Evelyn memorized the pattern of dents on the opposite wall. The wall memorized her back. When the door opened again, the air moved like a tiny weather system. An officer called names. The alto, the 2 boys, the ring-touching man. Their relatives had made bail, or their paperwork had wandered to the right desk. Zay and Evelyn remained, and a girl with braids who'd been silent the entire time. The officer shut the door as if embarrassed by the script. Zay called into the quiet without opening his eyes. "What's your name?" "Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn," he repeated, tasting the syllables as if they were a story he'd heard before. "I'll remember that." "You don't have to," she said, surprised by her own meanness. It wasn't truly meanness, more a defense against the idea that his remembering or not could matter. He opened his eyes and looked at her full on, not the polite glance of a boy figuring out how much of himself to spend, but the look of someone who had decided to spend it all. "I do," he said. The girl with braids spoke then, voice small but precise. "I ain't tell my mama." She laughed once, a little broken dish of a sound. "She think I'm at choir practice." Evelyn and Zay both nodded. The kind of nod that makes a triangle of strangers into something with corners strong enough to set a cup on. Zay began to speak about books he loved, Baldwin, a poet he called Brooks, a newspaper in Chicago that kept printing names when other papers printed numbers. He spoke the way some people pray, not to be heard, but because the speaking held them together. The door opened again just as the sky outside fell from afternoon to a color Evelyn had never known how to name, something between bruised and holy. "Carter," an officer called, voice already bored. Evelyn. She stood, knees reluctant to be knees. In the hallway, Ruthie waited with her handbag and a hat she saved for funerals. Her mother's face did not move, not toward anger nor relief, but the set of her shoulders changed, as if she had been carrying a bag of flour on her back and could now set it down. "Ma," Evelyn said. Ruthie put 2 fingers under her daughter's chin, lifted lightly, as if checking for the possibility of a song. "Let's go home," she said. They walked slow, as if not to disturb something fragile and sleeping between them. On the sidewalk, Ruthie spoke without looking. "You called me from your friend's house. You were brave." She let the word brave hang a moment, like laundry across an alley. "But you don't have to be brave for me." "I know," Evelyn said, and in that moment she did. At home, Ruthie set down a pot of beans that tasted like steadiness. After, she unfolded a quilt across Evelyn's knees, blocks of color sewn from dresses that had once gone to picnics and funerals and cash-only weddings. "This here is your grandmother's Sunday skirt," Ruthie said, tapping a patch of blue. "She wore it the first time she could vote and the last time she could sing the high note." Ruthie smiled, a quick flash like a match. "They both came in the same year." "Ma," Evelyn began and then stopped. The word sorry was in her mouth, sharp as a coin she'd been holding too long. Ruthie reached for the folded paper on the table, the verse Evelyn had carried and not surrendered. She smoothed it with the flat of her palm. "There's a way to live where you don't leave yourself behind," she said, eyes still on the paper. "Find that way, Evie." That night, sleep came like an unfamiliar relative, late with too much in its hands. When it finally sat down, Evelyn dreamed of apples rolling along curbs and blue jays reading traffic signals. In the morning, the bruises announced themselves like small practical truths. She sat on the edge of her bed and traced a finger along the purple rising at her wrist. At the kitchen table, a newspaper lay open to a photograph so grainy it looked like a storm. Signs, faces, a baton mid-swing. The caption said, "Unrest continues." Evelyn touched the paper softly, as if it were a cheek. No, she thought, and the thought was not anger but precision. Not unrest. A reaching toward rest that belongs to everybody. She went to the mirror and found her eyes, the part of her face that always looked like saying the name of a place you weren't sure you'd ever see. She tied a scarf around her hair, a small ceremony of becoming, and stepped into the day. Outside, the block had the same sounds it had always kept. A bus sighing like an old man, a baby announcing herself to the corner, somebody's radio leaking soul through a cracked window. Evelyn headed to the church, the place where the day now began. On the steps, Zay stood with a clean shirt and a bruise the color of aubergine blooming under his collarbone. He lifted 2 cups of coffee like an offering. "You came back," he said. "I was never gone," she said, surprising herself again with the accuracy of her mouth. Zay handed her a cup. "They need people for the voter education table," he said, "and someone to teach new folks how to hold the line when the line starts to move." "I don't know how to do that," she said, and then after a breath, "But I can learn." He smiled with one side of his mouth, a smile that had taught itself to be careful. That's the only kind of knowing that ever mattered. From the sanctuary, the piano began, Sister Louise's fingers turning wood and wire into something that remembered. Pastor Ellis nodded at them as if they were both very young and very old. Across the street, 2 white boys loitered and pretended to be bored. A jaybird flung itself into a small sermon on a telephone wire. Evelyn sipped the coffee. It was too sweet, the way the women in the basement made it when they'd already been up 4 hours. She let it coat her tongue until the sweetness found its balance. Then she set the cup down, tugged the scarf tighter, and joined the circle forming in the fellowship hall, the day expanding like a lung filled with brave air. "Eyes forward," Pastor Ellis said again, and this time Evelyn understood. Not denial of the past, not a forgetting, but a direction. A discipline. A way to walk while carrying the weight of names. They began to plan, and in the planning a future opened, narrow, dangerous, bright. Somewhere inside it, a girl would become a woman who understood how to hold the line, and how to lift it and make a bridge. She did not know that Zay would one day vanish between sentences, or that a letter would arrive decades late, changing the shape of her first love. She did not yet know the sound a courtroom makes when it eats a son. She did not know about fires that start where paper sleeps, or about a granddaughter who would point a camera and change how a city spoke. This morning, all she knew was the right now, which hummed like a wire in wind. A name said twice, a bruise fading from aubergine toward yellow, a quilt made of Sundays, and a cup of coffee too sweet to be anything but a promise. "Let's get to work," Evelyn said. And the day, as if it had been waiting politely to be asked, said yes. Atlanta taught Evelyn how a story could be a border and a bridge at once. Spelman's Brick and Magnolias wore their own uniform. Scholarship in Sunday clothes. The first week of classes, she learned to move between two Atlantas. The one printed on admissions brochures and the one scrawled on flyers taped to Union Hall doors. Mornings were lectures, American government with a professor who kept a photograph of Fannie Lou Hamer on his desk. Sociology with a woman whose lectures braided statistics with kitchen table truths. Afternoons belonged to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's off-campus storefront, where the copier coughed up leaflets that looked like weather warnings. Counter-narratives, Professor Dorsey said one day, writing the term in a slanted hand that refused to hurry. Truths that stand against the official record and ask to be read twice. Evelyn copied the word slowly, as if it were a key. She joined a media team whose entire budget fit inside a pencil tin. Their job: collect testimonies that the local papers wouldn't print, poll taxes paid in coins, literacy tests that asked Black grandmothers to interpret the Constitution with a pencil an inch long, cops who called traffic stops civic lessons. They recorded on a second-hand reel-to-reel that smelled faintly of a church basement. In the evenings, they edited in a dorm study room where the radiator clanged like a nervous drummer. "Tell me about the day they told you no," Evelyn would say, and the interviewee would look at her as if she had offered a chair. She learned to count silently as people searched for words. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, a life. When she wasn't interviewing, she taught younger students how to de-escalate at marches. She practiced the posture of nonviolence the way other girls practice piano scales. Shoulders low, voice calm, eyes soft enough to hold someone else's fury without breaking. She could feel herself becoming a person she could recognize even in the dark. Zay arrived twice a month on a Greyhound that always smelled like thyme. He volunteered with organizers working street by street in Fulton and DeKalb counties, persuading shop owners to post register here signs that would invite both voters and trouble. At night, he and Evelyn walked Auburn Avenue past shop windows that held what Black wealth looked like when it got to keep its receipts. Banks with brass rails, barbershops humming like bees. They argued amicably about strategy. He believed in big marches that forced reporters to aim their microphones correctly. She believed in doorbells and clipboards. "Both," he'd say. "We need both." "Both," she'd agree. And they would hold that word between them like a lamp. One night, after a meeting where the elders had said no to a student-led plan and everyone went home carrying a little private rage, Zay pressed a folder into her hands. "Don't open this here," he said. "Just later." It was thin as paper has a right to be, and heavier than its weight. She waited until her dorm was quiet, her roommate snoring softly, the radiator finally deciding to sleep. Inside the folder, 4 pages of typewritten notes, single-spaced, with names blacked out and too many specifics left in. This was not movement literature. This was surveillance. A summary of activities featuring people Evelyn loved. It listed dates and locations. Church basements, union halls, living rooms where the furniture remembered laughter. It noted the time a sermon moved a room from quiet to resolve. It noted when Evelyn asked a woman whether she wanted her voice recorded. It noted the scarf she wore, blue with white pin dots. The song sung, "We Shall Not Be Moved." The time the coffee urn sputtered empty. At the bottom of page 2 a line. Subject exhibits leadership tendencies. Repeated proximity to Isaiah Booker. The rest of the sentence had been inked out. She sat there with the papers in her lap while the radiator tried out a new rhythm. She knew, in the colloquial way that you know a bridge trembles when you cross it, that they were watched. Still, seeing words organize her life into somebody else's logic was a particular violation. She felt like a room where someone had measured the windows without asking. The next morning, she showed the folder to Professor Dorsey. He pressed his lips together until they whitened. "Where did you get this?" "Zay," she said. "Trust is a currency," he said finally. "Spend it carefully." He handed the folder back as if it were a hot iron. "Give this to someone who understands chain of custody. And Evelyn." He paused until she met his eye. "Remember that whoever wrote these pages believes they're writing history. Don't let them be the only one." At the storefront that afternoon, the copier died with a sound like resignation. While someone fetched the repairman, a girl named Loretta ran a training on how to move when a line breaks. "You don't step forward, you slide," she said, demonstrating. "You don't correct a marcher with your voice. You correct them with your elbow." She slid through them like a fish through reeds. "They want you to move like a crowd. You move like a choir." When the repairman arrived, he whistled under his breath at the stack of leaflets waiting for resurrection. He didn't ask to be paid immediately. "My wife's on your side," he said, patting the copier like a cow. That night, Evelyn and Zay sat under a lamppost that turned the world to sepia. She handed him the folder. "Where did you get it?" His eyes flickered. "A friend of a friend." Then he shook his head. "A leak." "Someone's in our meetings," she said. "Someone's in every meeting," he said. "The question is what they carry out with them." "What are we supposed to do?" she asked, and heard the thread of fear again, thin as fishing line. "Cut everyone out?" "Look," he said, soft but unblinking. "We make a world. We just have to be honest about what else lives in it." He reached over and touched the back of her hand, a light, deliberate touch that asked permission as well as gave it. "I don't know how to keep you safe," he said. "I don't know how to keep me safe. But I know why we're here." She didn't move her hand. "Say it," she said. "So one day a kid can go to the polls with a stale donut and a pencil stub and still get to mark a name that means something," he said. "So the map of who counts gets redrawn." Evelyn closed the folder and put it under the bench on the ground, as if the earth could absorb a little of its heat. "Then we keep writing," she said. "Louder than this." 2 weeks later, an anonymous tip told them the police were planning a raid. Where, they didn't know. They doubled their backups. Duplicate address lists, a hidden facing pages ledger where names were never next to numbers, a second set of tapes hidden in a box of hymnals. "Pray and plan," Pastor Ellis said over the phone when she called to ask for his blessing and his skepticism. In that order. The storefront hummed with a particular kind of calm, the kind that warehouses build before a hurricane. Evelyn looked around at the boys making duct tape repairs to a folding chair, the girls sorting testimonies into envelopes, the man in the corner rewriting a press release until it told the truth clean. She took a breath that felt like the field between who she had been and who she was now. "Let's go on," she said. They did. The noise arrived before the men. It was a Saturday night when the city keeps 2 sets of books, one for its praise and another for its sins. Evelyn and 4 others were still at the storefront, arranging voter education packets into tidy stacks like slices of a future. Zay had just left to walk a volunteer to her bus stop. The door was propped with a brick, because the hinge was tired and the evening was hot. Loretta hummed, "I'll fly away," without irony. The copier finally worked, its resurrected rhythm like a patient heartbeat. Then the sound. A boot scuff, a radio crackle, the sound of someone swallowing a yes. "Atlanta police," a voice barked, not waiting to be believed. 4 men entered, one already holding a box as if spoils had been pre-allotted. The tallest flicked his wrist to show a warrant that moved too quickly for eyes to read. The shortest stared at the walls, which had been repainted so often they looked like sedimentary rock. A 5th man, plainclothes, a tie that had tried and failed to be cheerful, hung back, scanning. "Hands where we can see 'em," the tallest said. Evelyn's hands had never felt so visible. She lifted them slowly, deliberately, like a dancer taught by grief. She watched a younger cop frown at a stack of index cards. "Names," the cards said, in the half-cursive of the girl who had made them. The cop's frown deepened, as if literacy were an insult. Gotta bag all printed materials, another said, already sweeping flyers into a cardboard box like a man clearing plates. Those are public information, Loretta said. Her voice wrapped in Sunday but not submissive. They're not contraband. The tallest gave her a look he probably practiced in mirrors. Everything's evidence if the right person says so. Evelyn stepped sideways, putting her body between the youngest volunteer and the cop closest to him, an elbow's width correction. We're not resisting, she said low. We're noting. Ma'am, said the plainclothes man, polite in a way that didn't feel kind. He had the kind of face that would never get a poem. You can note all you like. The men moved with the efficiency of people who had done this before. A drawer yielded stamps. A shelf yielded a ledger. A cardboard box yielded testimony tapes labeled in Ruthie Mae's neat loops, because Evelyn had enlisted her mother to help transcribe. The plainclothes man's hand halted there, and Evelyn saw something flicker. Recognition? He set the box down too carefully. Outside, a crowd formed the way crowds do when a street knows the smell of trouble. An older man from the barbershop called out, "They ain't hurting nobody in there." A woman with a toddler on her hip shook her head and said to no one, "They scared of paper now?" Zay returned just as an officer herded two volunteers toward the door. His eyes found Evelyn's and stayed. He lifted his hands without prompting. He had clearly memorized the script. When a cop pushed him against the doorway, his cheek pressed into flaking paint. He stared straight ahead at a pencil mark where someone had measured a child's height. The mark was dated last summer. "Where's your owner?" the youngest cop said, picking up a battered recorder as if it might confess. "This equipment belongs to somebody." "It belongs to a church that gives us space," Evelyn said. "Which you're standing in illegally because your warrant lists the wrong address." It was a bluff. She had only seen a flash of the paper. But she felt the plainclothes man study her, recalibrating. "Check the address," he said, almost bored. The tallest scowled and reread. For a heartbeat, his face was a math problem. "Damn street numbers," he muttered. He didn't stop the raid. He just stored the error in a pocket he thought no one could reach. "Load it up," he said. "We'll correct." As a box of tapes moved toward the doorway, Evelyn did the small thing that felt like oxygen. She slid a single tape from the stack into the space between the water cooler and the wall. "Aunt Bertha. Literacy test, 9/14, and let the cooler's metal skirt hide the plastic gray." The plainclothes man's eyes flicked. He saw her see him seeing. For a second he looked almost humanly tired. Then a match lit somewhere else in the city, and in the way that one thing leads to another, a trash can fire 3 doors down became a story about rioting, and sirens braided the avenue like a cheap necklace. People scattered, not because of guilt but because of experience. The officers stiffened as if all chaos were kin. The youngest knocked over the box of stamps, which fanned across the floor like vowels. "Everyone out," the tallest said. "Now." On the sidewalk the crowd swelled. A woman filmed with a camcorder the size of a loaf of bread, and a cop told her she couldn't. "Public space," she said, calm as a courthouse. "My money pays your shirt." Someone shouted that the fire down the block was out. Someone else shouted that the fire was a metaphor and didn't know how to stop. Barbers stood on their steps with arms crossed, their faces carved into patience. A boy on a bike rang his bell 3 times like punctuation. The cops carried out 2 boxes of papers, the ledger, and the cassette deck as if it would testify under oath. They did not arrest anyone. They did not have to. Their performance had already aired on the street's worried televisions. When the last blueback disappeared into a car, a silence fell that wasn't peace. Zay leaned his forehead against the doorframe until paint flecked his skin. "We got off light," he said. "We got robbed," Loretta said. "When the robber smiles, he's still a robber." "Inventory," Evelyn said, and her voice was steadier than her knees. "Let's list what they took. Then let's make double of whatever remains." They swept stamps off the floor, rescued stray leaflets from under chairs, counted envelopes. The tape behind the cooler waited like a seed. Across the street, the barbershop put its broom to the sidewalk, The old ritual of claiming space after disturbance. The woman with the camcorder walked in and asked whom to send the footage to. Send it to everybody, Evelyn said. And to no one yet. We'll tell you when. At midnight, the storefront looked itself again but thinner. They sat in a circle of metal chairs and compared bruises they could see to the ones they couldn't. Zay opened his palm to reveal a tiny star of paint, the color of old bone. He laughed once without humor. Auburn Avenue has constellations now. Evelyn placed the rescued tape in the center of their circle. Tomorrow, she said, we start again. They can steal our paper. They can't steal our mouths. Loretta lifted her chin. We'll sing louder. Don't sing for them, Zay said softly. Sing for the record. Outside, the street exhaled. Inside, they built their breath back, one counted testimony at a time. On Tuesday, the doorway delivered a woman who would rearrange Evelyn's map. The legal aid clinic on Edgewood Avenue had a waiting room the size of a confession. Plastic chairs. A bulletin board with overlapping notices that smelled faintly of thumbtack metal. A receptionist named Dee who carried a bowl of peppermints like a policy. Evelyn came to ask for strategy, not salvation. The raid had snatched their ledger and tapes. If the city chose to press charges, the wrong address on the warrant notwithstanding, they needed someone who could translate righteous anger into motions that stuck. She expected a lawyer who spoke in paragraphs. She did not expect Miriam Klein. Miriam had the long posture of someone trained to balance books on her head, and the quick laugh of someone who had once dropped one. She wore a navy skirt that had seen the inside of more than one courthouse and a cardigan with a snag at the cuff. Her hair was a constellation of decisions. She looked at Evelyn with presence, not curiosity, as if she had been waiting at an imaginary table and was relieved to see a chair finally filled. I'm Miriam, she said, sticking out a hand with ink on the first knuckle. I was at the city archives this morning. Sorry if I smell like dust and laws. Evelyn said. She liked the way Miriam said her own name like a declaration and not an apology. They sat in the tiny conference room where files towered like civic snowdrifts. Miriam opened a notebook already half filled with tidy script. Tell me everything, and then tell me what you don't want to put on paper. Evelyn told the story clean. She left out only the tape behind the cooler and the anonymous folder in her dorm, things that needed a different kind of chain of custody. Miriam listened the way good nurses listen. For symptoms and for the story a body tells the moment it stops trying to impress. Wrong address on the warrant is sloppy, Miriam said. They'll say technical error and proceed anyway. We can file a motion to suppress anything obtained under that warrant, but it will depend on the judge's appetite for embarrassment. Meanwhile, chain of custody on your materials? Broken, Evelyn said. On purpose. We never keep names with numbers. We duplicate. Good, Miriam said, and wrote good in the margin as if awarding a small scholarship. She asked about the tapes, the ledger, who had keys to the storefront, whether anyone new had joined the team recently. Evelyn spoke Zay's name and watched Miriam's face for reaction, found none except the faint wince all organizers earned when their private lives tried to sit in the middle of a meeting. She mentioned the plainclothes man's too careful hands. That'll be the Fed, Miriam said. Or city intelligence trying on a suit. They like to look like furniture. She slid a form across the table. We can file a request to inspect what they seized. They won't love it, but they'll respond. Meanwhile, you prepare public narrative. This is where you're better than we are. Counter-narratives, Evelyn said. Miriam nodded, delighted. Exactly. You tell the story before they do. They stayed an hour past what either had time for. Miriam asked a style of question Evelyn wanted to learn. Precise, compassionate, insistent. When Evelyn admitted she feared their circle had an informant, Miriam didn't flinch. Assume it, she said. And keep the welcome table open anyway. That's a hard way to live, Evelyn said. Miriam smiled without mirth. So is the law. At the doorway as they parted, Miriam paused. I know I'm not your people, she said. But if you ever need a couch or a place to hide a box, our apartment has both. Evelyn looked at the door jamb. The scuffed place where countless shoulders had said please and thank you and I can't. You're my people if you act like it, she said, surprised at her own authority. Miriam's eyes softened. I'll try to deserve that. 2 nights later, Miriam showed up at the storefront with donuts that tasted like apologies and copies of case law that tasted like hope. She watched Loretta teach de-escalation to a new batch of volunteers and asked to learn. She stood in the line and practiced sliding instead of stepping. She said, "Yes, ma'am," to an elder with a cane and did not pretend it was her custom. She brought her own tape recorder and asked who should have the key to it. Under the slow fan, Evelyn felt something click into place. Not a solution, but a companionship that could survive a hard rain. When Miriam laughed at one of Zay's jokes without looking to Evelyn for permission, Evelyn felt a flicker of relief. When Miriam stayed late to help a high school boy write a letter to his grandmother, Evelyn felt the flicker stabilize. "You move like a choir," Evelyn said as they stacked chairs. Miriam tilted her head. "I don't sing on key." "That's all right," Evelyn said. "We got harmony covered." On Sunday, Miriam visited New Hope. She sat beside Evelyn and swayed clumsily, and no one asked her to sway better. Pastor Ellis preached on walls, Jerichos, Berlins, the invisible ones built by people whose hands never touched mortar. He looked straight at the pew where Evelyn and Miriam sat and said, "Sometimes the trumpet is a camera. Sometimes it is a brief." After service in the fellowship hall, Ruthie Mae served Miriam a plate that weighed like love. "You look like someone's sister," Ruthie said, evaluating with her chin. "Which means you're mine." Miriam blinked fast. "Yes, ma'am." Later, when they walked Miriam to her car, an unmarked sedan idled across the street. The plainclothes man from the raid sat behind the wheel, his face a poker hand. He lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel like an apology he couldn't afford. Evelyn didn't wave. Miriam didn't either. They simply stood there and noted. "Let him get used to seeing you," Evelyn said. "I'm very visible," Miriam said dryly, gesturing at her cardigan. "We'll make that useful," Evelyn said, and believed it. The doorway had delivered. The world would test the door. Evelyn and Ruthie rode the bus home to Birmingham with a grocery bag between them like an heirloom. It was fall break. The dogwood trees along Peachtree looked like gossiping ladies in red shawls. Evelyn wore her scarf with the white pin dots and a sweater Ruthie had coaxed from an old pattern. The bus hissed out of the station into a day that had learned how to be cool without being cold. Ruthie didn't ask for details about raids or rifled drawers. She asked whether Evelyn had been eating greens, whether her shoes were holding, whether she slept near a window. Then, halfway past Douglasville, she reached into the grocery bag and produced a paperback whose cover made her heart do a familiar old thing. The Negro Motorist Green Book, 1961. "Found it in Sister May's attic," Ruthie said, "the way some women said found my ring. Figured you'd want to carry some of our maps on your knees a while." They flipped through listings that spoke a language Evelyn knew from childhood: road trips, tourist homes, filling stations, beauty parlors, churches that won't turn you away. Next to Birmingham, a neat column of names with addresses that remembered not being welcome elsewhere. Next to Atlanta, a list of boarding houses that had once been the difference between going and arriving. "Daddy used to read this like scripture," Ruthie said, eyes on the window, voice on the book. "We'd find a place by the time light got thin and he'd say, 'Everybody got a front door somewhere.'" "You kept it?" Evelyn asked. "I kept everything," Ruthie said, "because I knew one day y'all would need to see how we made a way." 2 rows back, a man in a cap folded and unfolded a newspaper until the headline tired. Across the aisle, a young mother hummed to a sleeping baby whose fingers still held a fist of air. The bus lurched through Georgia as if the state were a conversation. "Your father had a laugh like an engine," Ruthie said, surprising Evelyn with a tenderness she rarely displayed. "He laughed that way the night we got to a little place outside Montgomery and the lady said, 'Come on in, baby.' He laughed like a tire finally hitting good road." "What happened to him?" Evelyn asked, not for the first time, not expecting a new answer. Ruthie's hand stilled. She smoothed the green book's dog-eared corner and looked as if she were deciding whether to set a table or clear one. "He went to work and he didn't come home," she said. "Some people don't get a story. They just get a hole." Evelyn nodded. The hole had lived at the end of their hall, where his hat had hung for a while, then not. It lived in the kitchen where Ruthie washed the same 2 plates and looked out the window as if a horizon could confess. "Don't you go making your life around holes," Ruthie said, turning to examine her daughter's face the way a midwife studies a newborn for the map of its future. "Make it around tables. Make it around names." They arrived in Birmingham in the middle light, neither afternoon nor evening. On the walk home, neighborhood boys played stickball with a ferocity that suggested sports were the truest form of politics. Pastor Ellis swept the church steps again, a man who believed in daily liturgies. He lifted his broom as if in benediction. At the house, the kitchen smelled of onions and a ham bone remembering Sunday. Ruthie set water to boil and reached for a sack of rice. "I'll make chicken bog," she said. "My mama made it when somebody come home. Sticks your bones back together." Evelyn sat at the table and unfolded the green book. The listings read like a roll call. The people who had made themselves into hospitality. She imagined their faces, women with aprons that meant business, men with sleeves rolled to show forearms like negotiations, teenagers darting to the back room to fetch extra towels. In the margin by Carter's tourist home, Decatur, someone had written in pencil, "Closed 1963. Mrs. C passed." Evelyn ran her finger over the note as if it were Braille. "They acted like that book became obsolete," Ruthie said, chopping onions. "It didn't. We just carry it in our heads now, and in our habits." After supper, they sat with cups of coffee sweet enough to declare their intentions. Ruthie pulled out a box that smelled like cedar and newspapers. "These are your grandmother's," she said, lifting photographs that held 50 years of Sundays and Tuesdays and funerals and boats that never came. There were pictures of men in hats with their chins lifted like declarations, girls with braids and eyes set on far horizons, kitchens where smiles leaned on each other. Ruthie told the names as if reading a list of weather patterns. "This your Aunt Robbie," Ruthie said, tapping a photo of a woman with a thick plate and a skeptical mouth. "Mean as a blue jay, sweet as a hymn. Went north in 52. Sent $10 at Christmas every year like clock hands. This your cousin Della," she said, pointing to a girl with a homemade dress and sturdy legs. "Wasn't supposed to live past 6. Lived to 92 on spite and pound cake." Stories built a scaffold around them until the house felt both bigger and easier to hold. "Ma," Evelyn said finally, "at the clinic there's this lawyer. Miriam. She's—" Evelyn paused, searching for the exact phrase. "She shows up like a person who knows she can be used." Ruthie's mouth did a near smile. "And you like her?" "I do," Evelyn said, feeling the weight and lightness of that truth. "In the kind of way that helps." "Let folks help you," Ruthie said. "You can be strong and still say yes." There was a knock then, the polite double of a man raised by a woman who slapped hands away from hot pans. Pastor Ellis stood on the porch holding a paper bag and a look that said, "I come bearing both good news and caution." Ruthie ushered him in with the authority of a woman who ran births like campaigns. "Evening, Miss Ruthie." "Evelyn," he said. He set the bag on the table. It held peaches that looked like they remembered July more personally than most. "2 things. First, the city council is scheduling a hearing on police conduct. No power in it but a microphone. Second," he hesitated, glanced at Ruthie as if asking permission to make her kitchen heavier. "There's talk of a developer sniffing around our block. Federal funds. Words like revitalization and corridor. You'll know how I feel about corridors that pass straight through us." Ruthie snorted. "A corridor's just a hallway that leads to other people's rooms." "We'll be ready," Evelyn said, surprising herself with the speed of her certainty. "We'll show up with maps older than their blueprints." Pastor Ellis nodded, a small bow to prophecy. "Good. And Evelyn, some of the girls say you train lines like they was choirs. We may need a choir soon." After he left, Ruthie looked at her daughter long and slow. This is your life, she said. Don't let it happen to you. Happen to it. That night, Evelyn lay under the quilt with the Sunday patches and listened to the city inventory itself. Cars, dogs, a neighbor's radio searching for a station. She dreamed she was standing in a room of doors. Some led to rooms she knew. Some led to holes. She woke before she chose. In the morning, she and Ruthie went to the market. People said hello in the way of a neighborhood that has learned to inventory its blessings. On the way home, they passed a storefront with a dusty window. A for lease sign tilted in the glass like a bad tooth. Evelyn saw, not the dust but the possibility, Community Education Center. The sign might read, "Know your rights. Know your stories. Register here." "Ma," she said, stopping. "What if," Ruthie followed her gaze. "If you going to make a center, baby, make sure it got a kitchen. Movements run on rice." They stood there, two women with groceries, measuring a future with their eyes the way seamstresses measure without tape. "Everybody got a front door somewhere," Ruthie said again. "Maybe this is one of yours." Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't have to. The city, which had butted its head against her all summer, felt, for a breath, like a house she could be inside of on purpose. When they returned to Atlanta 2 days later, the Green Book rode on Evelyn's lap. She held it with both hands as the bus ate the miles. Somewhere near the state line, she pressed her palm flat to the listing that bore her name through an accident of history. Carter's Tourist Home, Decatur, and whispered, "I see you." It felt like a prayer to a family she was still meeting. It felt like a promise to a future that would need a map. Rumor always found exact change. It started as a whisper on a church step. Someone had seen Zay talking low to a man who didn't belong. Then a half-fact from a girl whose cousin worked nights at the precinct. There was a source close to the students. The folder in Evelyn's drawer turned heavier by the hour. In every meeting she felt a new draft. Windows she hadn't known were open. On a Tuesday that began like a promise, Zay didn't show. He was due at the storefront at 3 to walk a new volunteer through door-knocking routes. At 4:30, Loretta cracked her knuckles and said she hated tardiness more than sin. At 6, the pay phone on the corner became a shrine to the prayer of dialing. Evelyn fed it nickels and dimes, then quarters when the operator demanded tribute. The ring on his end went on, a train through fog. Nothing. By 9, Auburn Avenue wore night like a bruise. The barber locked his door with a sigh. The woman with the camcorder waved on her way to the late shift at Grady. Evelyn sat on the curb with her back to the storefront, forehead against her forearms, and allowed herself 1 minute of private panic. Then she stood and sorted flyers no one would read tonight. He didn't come the next day either. Or the next. The rumor changed shape to match the room. In the dorm, someone said he'd been seen near the Federal Building. In the storefront, someone else said he'd been offered money. Pastor Ellis said not every absence is betrayal. Sometimes it's a bruise that hasn't learned to speak. Miriam said carefully that the Bureau had a talent for creating exactly this kind of fracture. "Call his aunt," Ruthie said over the phone. "Women tell the truth when their boys go missing." Evelyn did. Aunt Laverne answered on the second ring, voice thick with exhaustion. "He's breathing," she said without greeting. "He went to ground. Said he had to let a storm pass. That's all I know, and more than I want." "Is he?" Evelyn swallowed. "Is he working with them?" Aunt Laverne exhaled like a tire. "Baby, I have fed that boy collards and stubborn since he teethed. I don't know what he's doing now. Fear makes a person move funny." She paused. "So does love." The storefront felt like a room with a missing stair. They learned to step over the space where Zay's laughter had been. Evelyn kept teaching de-escalation, kept logging testimonies, kept checking the corner payphone the way you check a healed bone when rain threatens. Once, in a night thick with summer's last heat, she lifted the receiver and heard the faintest breath, as if the phone itself had lungs. "Zay," she said. The line clicked and died. On a Sunday after a week that had been all nouns and no verbs, Evelyn walked to the river. She stood where the city's old bones used to be loaded onto trains and said his name once. Names, she understood now, were work. You said them into the world to keep the world from forgetting the shape a person made. That night, a letter slid under her dorm door. No address, no salutation. I have to disappear to keep from being turned into something I'm not, it said in handwriting that had once annotated Baldwin in the margins. Don't wait up. Don't harden. At the bottom, a sentence that made her sit on the floor like the wind had shoved her. If I come back wrong, don't let me stay. She folded the letter into the green book. Grief didn't end anything. It simply adjusted the weight of what she carried and asked her to keep walking. The 70s arrived like a cousin, same blood, different stories. Evelyn finished school and did the bravest domestic thing she knew. She stayed. While friends chased graduate programs or cities that promised better weather for beginners, she took a job teaching 11th grade history at Douglas High and rented a walk-up that smelled of laundry and honeysuckle. In the quiet line between the movement's headlines, she learned the disciplined tenderness of showing up at exactly 7:35 a.m. Thomas Carter taught next door. U.S. history in a voice that never had to raise itself to be heard. He had a slow smile that looked like he'd found a way to live with certain disappointments. On his second day, he borrowed chalk from her, and on his fifth, he returned it with a clean eraser and a thermos of coffee that tasted like good intentions and too much sugar. Thomas Carter, he said, offering a hand that had held too many paperbacks. No relation. Yet, Loretta muttered later, tying a bulletin board with string. Evelyn threw her an eraser. Evelyn built a classroom where the walls did some of the teaching. On one, a timeline of local events that never made textbooks. The sanitation workers' strike, the church that rebuilt itself twice, the neighborhood grocery that extended credit without paperwork. On another, a map drawn by students, our city according to feet, with bus routes and safe porches and the corner where the cops lingered. She snuck in poets when no one was looking. History isn't just what someone typeset, she told her students, sliding the green book into view like a contraband scripture. It's what your grandmothers kept in a drawer. She led them to the archive on their lunch break. She taught them to handle old paper as if turning a page could change a verdict. She watched boys who got loud in hallways go quiet before a photograph of a march, their bodies remembering some other formation. Thomas and Evelyn walked home together most days, their steps finding a democracy of pace. He asked questions the way a gardener asks the ground what it needs. She found that the quiet between his sentences rested her. One evening after a PTA meeting where a father accused the school of conspiring to keep his son from calculus, Thomas stood at the chain-link fence and said simply, I think love is repeating yourself without making it feel like punishment. Evelyn could have spent 10 years with a sentence like that. She spent 3 months instead. Then married him in Ruthie Mae's church with a cake that tried to be 2 layers and mostly succeeded. Pastor Ellis said amen over rings bought with teacher salaries and promised to pray for better pay as fervently as he prayed for long union. They made a home of 2 bookshelves, a table that wobbled until Thomas fixed it, and a bed that did not. There was a lemon plant in the window that refused to give fruit but offered leaves that smelled like futures anyway. They ate too much spaghetti and argued amiably about whether jazz needed words. They wrote letters to Miriam, who sent back postcards from law conferences with margins full of doable things. On their first summer break, Evelyn painted the community center's front room and hung a sign Ruthie had sewn. New Hope Education and Rights. The kitchen Ruthie demanded sat at the back, where pots could work out their arguments while politics raged in the front. They hosted tenant meetings, GED classes, a Wednesday night clinic where Miriam taught people to read leases like the contracts they were. On a Tuesday evening while chalk dust still ghosted their fingers, Thomas said, You know, I'd like to be somebody's father. It was less a declaration than a question placed gently on the table. Yes, Evelyn said, before fear could draft a memo. Me too. 9 months later, Malcolm arrived in winter like a person who had been practicing his breath. He had a forehead that invited kisses and fists that announced clauses. Ruthie held him with the authority of a woman who had argued with death before and won. Pastor Ellis prayed a prayer that could have been a lullaby. Mac, Thomas whispered into the soft of the boy's skull. A nickname that shortened the world to what they could hold. The 70s didn't ask permission. They came for the city in ways the 60s had merely warned about. Layoffs, a tax base slipping its leash, landlords who learned how to make money on emptiness. But for a while, in the triangle of classroom, church, and center, the Carters built a life with reliable weather. On the anniversary of their wedding, Evelyn lit a candle for Zay and didn't tell Thomas. Some maps you carry alone so they don't confuse the compass of your daily kindness. The textbook was the color of unripe pears and twice as boring. Evelyn cracked its spine with the moral reluctance of a doctor inflicting necessary pain. American History, Southern Edition, the cover said, as if geography were an alibi. Inside, the civil rights movement took up 8 pages between a chapter on interstate highways and a celebration of free enterprise. The paragraph on Birmingham could have been about a bake sale. The photograph of a lunch counter sit-in didn't show the men's hands. "Children," Evelyn said to her 11th graders, "we are about to learn how to read like detectives and write like prosecutors." She and Thomas gathered a coalition that looked like a choir. Teachers, parents, a janitor with perfect recall, a grandmother who had kept every leaflet since '62. Miriam drafted a brief that read like plain English about how supplemental materials were in fact essential ones. Pastor Ellis offered the church as a meeting hall and vowed to bring potato salad that would shame the devil. At the school board meeting, the superintendent smiled the way men smile when they have rehearsed it in mirrors. He called the textbook approved curriculum. Evelyn held up a photograph of a local march and said, "This is approved history." She read passages from the book in a tone that made their evasions sound obscene. A student named Tasha stood and recited the names of everyone in her family who had marched, worked a poll, or lost a job for joining a union. Thomas spoke gently, as if coaxing a bird down from a wire. "We are teaching children how to love a country enough to argue with it," he said. "Give us the pages that tell the truth." A board member, tie tight, conscience loose, said, "We can't include every perspective." "Start with more than one," Miriam said from the back. A mother who cleaned houses for a living stood and held up her hands, palms raw from bleach. "My boy came home and said Dr. King was a nice man people didn't like," she said. "I told him that's the kind of sentence you use when you don't want to say who did what to whom. Fix your sentences." The vote was 3-4 against them. The superintendent smiled again. The potato salad consoled more people than policy did. But defeat schooled them. They pivoted to the long work, the people's syllabus. Students gathered oral histories from their blocks. Elders pulled photo albums onto tables. A retired journalist taught captions. The janitor remembered which day in '69 the city tried to erase. They mimeographed booklets with covers designed by a boy who had a crush on typefaces. "Your homework," Evelyn told her class, "is to interview someone whose hands have done something for this neighborhood. Ask them what they built. Ask them what they were kept from building." The superintendent tried to ban the booklet. He discovered the geometry of community. Ban 1 photocopy and 100 appear. Churches stocked stacks next to hymnals. The barbershop taped the cover in the window. Teenagers read pieces aloud on city buses, and riders clapped like they were on a different kind of route. At the next school board meeting, the superintendent didn't smile. He asked whether the supplement could be piloted in one school. The vote passed. The textbook lost 8 pages monopoly. No one called it victory. Everyone called it a start. On the walk home, Thomas squeezed Evelyn's fingers. "They'll come for us in other ways," he said. "They always do," she said, and kissed his knuckles like a vow. That night, she tucked Mac into a crib that creaked like an old pew. She whispered the names of the people in the booklet until he slept. When he reads, she thought, let the verbs be honest. The '80s taught the block a new grammar. Crack, siren, pawn, lock. It arrived quietly, first as rumors of a rock that felt like permission, then as boys on corners whose laughter turned sharp, then as mothers learning a new type of count. Days between court dates, hours between paychecks and bail. Evelyn watched the corner where Mac's friends gathered and felt her breath shorten by inches. Mac was spun sugar charming and fast with a joke, growing tall in ways that made strangers forgive him before he asked. He loved basketball and the back steps where Thomas told stories about Reconstruction like a late-night radio host. He loved danger like a song on the wrong station. You got to pick which risk you can afford. Evelyn told him one night when he came home with a new jacket that cost too much for a teacher's son. Because risk doesn't offer payment plans. I'm good, Ma, he said, the phrase that has talked mothers out of sleep since language began. I ain't stupid. You ain't invincible, Thomas said kindly. Which is different? The community center turned triage. Job counseling shared space with grief groups. Miriam came Tuesdays to help with expungement petitions, and explained how a juvenile record could haunt a man like the shadow of a streetlight. The kitchen ran a quiet under-the-table food bank because pride is loud and hunger stoops. A boy named Darnell, who had once written the best caption in the People's Syllabus, started staying late to mop floors just to be in a room where his name meant something other than a file. He stopped showing up. A girl named Keisha who could calculate faster than the calculator began bringing her little brother to Wednesday night tutoring with a face that did not have time for anyone's mess. On Thursdays, Pastor Ellis held prayer like a dock rope, and sometimes it held. One evening the cops did what they called a sweep. They took boys and a couple of men and one grandmother who had shouted too near a badge. They took the pay phone off the corner because it had learned too many stories. They took Darnell. They took the laughter off the block and replaced it with quiet that remembered how to scream. Mac came home late, eyes bright in a way that made Evelyn look past him at the air. She pressed her hand to his chest. His heart thudded as if to say present. Where were you? She asked. With Dre, he said. At the court. You know I've been in courtrooms, she said, soft as a switch. They don't serve fun there. He lifted his chin. You don't know everywhere I am. I know enough, she said, to tell you there are men whose job is to make you a number. He looked at Thomas, seeking softness that isn't mother-shaped. Dad. Thomas looked at him like a boy he remembered at 6. Your mother's not the cop here, he said. She's the map. Try not to prefer getting lost. Max stormed into his room and slammed the door with the poetry of 17. Evelyn leaned against the hallway wall and asked the paint for patience. 2 weeks later, a siren stopped at their block and refused to leave. The cops took Dre. They left Max standing with empty hands he couldn't explain. Evelyn stood on the stoop and watched the street rearrange its furniture. That night, while she graded essays about the Louisiana Purchase as if that piece of land explained anything worth explaining, she heard Matt crying into his pillow the way boys do when they think the sound can't get under a door. She stood in the hallway and did not go in. She wanted to be a place he could come to, not a place that chased him. In church on Sunday, Pastor Ellis said, "We are not a people of inevitability," and the congregation said amen in a tone that asked God to consider a proof. Outside, a developer's glossy flyer appeared under windshield wipers and on stoops, the kind of paper that made fingers feel slick. Jackson Corridor Revitalization, it sang. Safer streets. Stronger tax base. A new day. The artist's rendering showed a cafe where the barbershop stood, and a woman with a yoga mat who had never breathed this block's air. They call it an orchard, Thomas said, holding the flyer with tongs as if it might bite. But the concrete's the only thing they plan to plant. Evelyn felt a familiar steadiness climb her spine. Then we'll be farmers of what's left. The arrest was small the way an earthquake starts small. A Tuesday. A sky the color of dishwater. Mac, 20, had found a job unloading trucks at a wholesaler with a boss who praised with grunts. He'd been showing up even when he wanted to sleep, which felt like a win Evelyn kept in her pocket. On his way home at the corner where the payphone used to be, a patrol car idled. A stop. A search. A match to a description that could have dressed half the city. A bag in the gutter no one would claim. A charge assembled like furniture you buy flat in a box. By the time Evelyn reached the precinct, Mac had a paper bracelet on his wrist and a look she had never seen. A boy learning the choreography of a trap. The officer at the desk said words like possession and intent and arraignment in a tone that suggested the weather. Miriam arrived before sunset, hair half raised by the speed of her call. She spoke to Mac through the glass with a voice that aimed for eye level. "You say only what you need to say," she told him. "Which is, I want my lawyer." The system counts on your nerves. Don't count for them. Evelyn wanted to put her hand through the glass and cup his cheek like when he had a fever and the night was their third parent. She wanted to say she could take the time he was about to lose and fold it back into his pocket. Instead she said, "You breathe on purpose, you hear?" He nodded once, the jerk of a man assembling himself with twine. Arraignment was a hallway of men with folders and women with bags that held everything. The judge had a calendar for a face. Bail was set at a number designed to translate poverty into months. Evelyn swallowed a sound and reached for Thomas's hand. He held it like a man who knew a 1,000-year knot. In the weeks that followed, the courthouse taught Evelyn the metrics of slow. Papers shuffled. Motions filed. Continuances requested with the sigh of a system that loves its own procedures more than its supposed purpose. Miriam constellated a defense. Character letters from teachers, employment records, an affidavit from the barbershop owner who had known Mac since he had teeth. She filed a motion to suppress based on the stop's description, and the fact that the bag in question had no fingerprints the state wished to discuss. The prosecutor smiled the way men smile when they've practiced in a different mirror than the superintendent's. He offered a deal that tasted like gray. Plea down, accept a felony, go home sooner. Never be able to vote or rent in the better buildings. He said it like weather. I can beat some of this, Miriam told them in a conference room with a table that smelled like meetings. But I cannot beat the geology of this courthouse. We need letters. We need pastors. We need a man from his job to put on a tie. Evelyn said yes to everything, knocked on doors she hadn't knocked on since the voter drives. She printed Mac's report cards from middle school, as if A-minuses could argue with the charge. She stood in the community center's kitchen and asked God for favors she had never presumed to collect. On the second Friday, after a day of waiting for paperwork to grow legs, Evelyn went home to find Ruthie sitting on the stoop with a casserole that smoked like comfort. Ruthie's face had the set of a woman who would fight a train. "Ma," Evelyn said and then didn't. "They building a whole country inside that courthouse," Ruthie said. "And it don't look like the brochure. We'll bring our own furniture." Court day arrived under a sky that pretended to be ordinary. The gallery filled with a village. Teachers in their Sunday clothes on a Tuesday, boys with fresh haircuts who wanted to see a man stay theirs, women carrying bags big enough to hold a family. Pastor Ellis sat in the second row like a stone that water flowed around. The barbershop owner wore a suit that had not seen daylight in 5 years. The officer who had made the stop testified with a careful memory of a man who had been coached. Miriam asked him to describe the match to the description. He described youth, height, a jacket color, and a neighborhood, the kind of description that would have fit a church picnic. She asked about the bag in the gutter. He said it was within reach of Mac, which is the distance between any two men a city decides to join. She asked whether the stop was recorded on his body camera. He said the device had malfunctioned. The judge's face had weather in it. He sustained some objections, overruled others, watched the clock like it might betray him. When Miriam called Evelyn, the courtroom breathed in. Evelyn stood, knees steady because fear had learned her balance years ago. She spoke about a boy who had majored in charm and minor trouble, and who had come home more lately than not. She said, "I am not here to pretend he is perfect. I am here to say his life is not a file. He has a grandmother who prays names into quilts. He has a room where the books have bent his mattress. He has a job where his boss says he shows up even when he wants to sleep. That should matter." She did not cry. She did not apologize. She looked at the judge as if she were placing something on a table between them, and asking him not to call it something else. The judge tapped his pen against the bench, the Morse code of men who like to be thought merciful. He denied the suppression. He frowned at the bag. He accepted the plea to a lesser charge with a term that translated to months in years after. Paper bracelets became an orange jumpsuit. Mac turned and looked for his mother. Evelyn raised their clasped hands in the air like a promise she intended to keep. When they walked out, the air felt wrong, thin where it should have been generous. On the courthouse steps, Trent Wallace handed a reporter his card and said words like revitalization into a microphone. He smiled with every tooth. Evelyn stopped. Her anger braided itself into something usable. She looked at Thomas and Miriam and Pastor Ellis. "We're not letting them build a future on our son," she said. "We weren't planning to," Miriam said, weary and ready. Evelyn squared her shoulders toward the city that had taught her how to hold a line and how to move it. Somewhere inside the courthouse, her boys sat in a room with no clocks. Somewhere outside the block learned a new chant. Somewhere ahead, a granddaughter would lift a camera and make it impossible not to see. But today there was only the street, the lemon tree in the window that still hadn't fruited, the community center with a kitchen where beans could simmer while plans were sketched, and a mother who refused to let a file tell the story of a life. "Let's get to work," she said again, and the words didn't sound like repetition. They sounded like breath. The first night back, the apartment sounded wrong without Mac's shoes under the chair. Evelyn found herself placing small order on the disorder. She folded the throw blanket twice, set the salt back on the left of the pepper, straightened the photo of Mac at 8 holding a paper plate of birthday cake. Her hands wanted to fix what could be fixed so her heart wouldn't try to fix what couldn't. On visiting days, the jail's fluorescent light flattened everything. Mothers clutched Ziplocs as if they were passports. Guards spoke the language of rules the way men speak after they've stopped hoping to be loved. Evelyn queued with women in hairnets and church hats, with toddlers who learned to play quietly in lines. In the visiting booth, Mac wore the beige of a sentence. His eyes were older by weeks in a way that should have taken years. He tried to grin, his old major, but it didn't land. "You eating?" she asked. "They don't starve you," he said. "They just make you wish you didn't know about taste." "You sleeping?" "I dream about walking," he said and laughed like a cough. "Isn't that stupid?" She pressed her palm to the glass. He pressed his to its twin. The barrier hummed with fingerprints. "We're going to build the floor back under you," she said. "When you come home, some steps will be missing. We'll put boards there. But you'll walk." "Mom," he said, not Ma, the longer name, the one he used when he was trying not to be a boy. "You going to be mad if I'm different?" "I'm going to be here if you're different," she said. "And if you're the same. And if you're wrong and when you're better." He nodded like a man memorizing a route in case the map gets soaked. After, Evelyn stood with her forehead against the cool hallway tile the way she had leaned against church pillars during long meetings. She breathed like work. At home, Thomas learned the daily ways of being a father with his hands tied. How to fix the leaky sink and not pretend that was the leak that mattered. How to sit in Mac's room and read aloud to Dust. How to offer his shoulder without offering advice that would make a boy feel small. In bed at night, he and Evelyn spoke softly into the joint custody of darkness. "I keep thinking, where did we miss the stair?" Thomas said once. "We didn't," Evelyn said. "The stairs were missing when we got here. We gave him handrails. We told him where to step. But they were missing. That's the truth." At the center, re-entry planning began before release. Miriam assembled a list like a toolkit. Expungement petitions, employers who didn't flinch, a landlord in the next zip code who took a chance if the church co-signed, a counselor who didn't say choices like a weapon. Pastor Ellis gathered men who had come home and not left again. They met on Wednesdays and told the truth like they were tired of other genres. "First week out, you going to want to go everywhere," one man said, chuckling. "Everything going to be loud. Pick one place. Go there. Come home. Your boys on the corner are going to say they saved your seat," said another. "Don't sit." A third man, younger, took a breath like a plank. "Sometimes your mama going to look at you like you a glass bowl she loved that got cracked. That's all right. She learning to." The center also held grief. Dre's mother began coming in, back straighter than any chair. She didn't cry. She asked for copies of forms and denials like it was her job. Evelyn sat with her and learned how to be present for a woman building a memorial out of errands. On a humid Thursday, Mac called collect. When the tape voice asked if she would accept charges from Malcolm Carter, Evelyn said yes fast enough to make the machine stumble. "I got a date," he said, meaning release. She wrote it in big numbers on the calendar, March 18th. Go slow, she said. Let the day be small. He made a noise that was not quite a laugh. I don't remember how to be small. You remember, she said. You were 5 once. On March 18th, the sun did an impression of spring. Evelyn and Thomas stood outside the gate holding a crumpled bag with jeans and a t-shirt and shoes that looked like home if you squinted. When Mac came through, he was both the boy who had broken his roller skate and the man who had read the grievance procedure 3 times. He hugged his mother with an apology in his shoulders. He hugged his father like a man grateful for a door that had stayed unlocked. They drove home with the windows cracked an inch. The city rushed at Mac's face like it was introducing itself all over again. At a light, he flinched when a siren passed. He stared at the little lemon plant in the window like a trick. At the apartment, he stood in the doorway to his room, taking in the bed, the books, the poster he'd taped lopsided 3 years ago. It's like a museum, he said softly. It's like a place about me, not mine. It's both, Evelyn said. We'll move the furniture till it's yours again. He slept too hard the first night, then not at all the next. He went to meetings with the men on Wednesdays and spoke when he was ready. He took the job at the wholesaler back. He made it 4 days before a supervisor said felon, like he was saying forklift. He came home with his jaw tight. I can't keep asking favors, he said. You can until you don't need to, Evelyn said. That's what favors are for. He slammed his hand on the table and then looked stricken at his own noise. Sorry, he said. Don't be sorry for having a pulse, Thomas murmured. Just don't break the table. On Sundays, Mac sat in the back row of church, the row for people who are here and deciding whether to stay. After service, old women pressed bills into his hand as if he were a grandchild who had returned from the Navy. He tried not to cry. He failed in the parking lot. Evelyn pretended not to see, and then put a tissue in his pocket without comment. The house was livable again. Some steps were still missing. They learned to put boards where boards would hold. They learned to leap where they had to. They learned to build. Jade was born with a witness in her eyes. When she arrived, Mac holding her like a fragile moon, the mother's hand in Evelyn's, Thomas singing something he claimed wasn't a lullaby. She looked around with the audit of a small general. She grew into a girl who could sit still only for the sake of a photograph, who made straight A's and trouble for teachers who lied about reconstruction. When she found a used cannon at a yard sale, she lifted it to her face and the world learned new edges. Look, she'd say to Evelyn, bringing the camera close as if it were a seashell. This is Mr. Jenkins's hands. You can see the knife scar from 78. Or, this is the step the city never fixed, but look at the chalk from the kids. They made a hopscotch around it like an altar. Mac, who had returned to himself slowly and imperfectly, watched his daughter turn the block into archive. Pride tightened his throat until he coughed it loose. He coached her footwork on the court and her posture at the mic when she read in church. He taught her to smell trouble before it turned the corner. She taught him how to upload. On an April evening in 2014, everything radio stations love to call ordinary, blue chalk sky, a siren far away, a woman dragging a hose across a yard, was broken in the middle. A police stop turned because the officer turned it. A man's name, Dion, who had once tutored kids at the center, was made into a number. The officer said he saw a weapon. The video said he saw a man. Jade was there. She had been photographing old brick when the sounds changed. She lifted the cannon, then her phone, then the cannon again for the zoom. She kept her hands steady while her breath shook. She filmed a woman screaming a name into air. She filmed the moment an officer realized he was being filmed and rearranged his face. She filmed the sidewalk like a verdict. By midnight, the video was online. By morning, it had moved like weather. The city learned 2 new words for an old phenomenon: livestream trending. Reporters found the block with microphones that didn't know how to ask questions. Jade watched them the way you watch a neighbor drive the wrong way down a one-way. When one asked, "How did this make you feel?" Jade tilted her head. "Ask me what it made me remember," she said. "Okay," the reporter stuttered. "What did it make you remember?" Everything, Jade said. Then she filmed the reporter because power should also be recorded. Protests braided with prayer. The first march felt like an echo of the one that had started Evelyn's life. There were more signs now, better printers, worse laws. There were more cameras, which was both proof and risk. The chant was both older and newer, say his name. In the street, Jade learned to walk backward while filming to keep the line without being the line. She wore a bandana not because it was stylish but because pepper spray has no conscience. Evelyn walked near her, body a hinge between past and present, calling out, "Water here. Milk here. Breathe." Miriam set up a portable legal clinic at the church, charging phones and drafting emergency motions with a Sharpie on cardboard before typing them formally later. She briefed kids on their rights in the cadence of a choir. Mac carried water and his temper. He did not trust cops. He did not trust himself not to say it the way it burned in him. He kept to the edges for Jade's sake and to protect the fragile scaffolding of his re-entry. If anyone touched his daughter, he did not trust jail to be long enough. A week in, at a march that turned a corner into an argument, an officer shoved a teenager against a storefront. The storefront had once been the movement office. Jade's camera caught the push. Her breath caught the rest. "Back up," someone yelled, not at Jade but at youth who had learned new ways to be brave. The line stuttered and then remembered itself. After, in the fellowship hall, people told the story as if reading an algebraic proof of what everyone already knew. "They are not here to make us safe." The older folks talked de-escalation like recipes, the younger ones talked platforms and hashtags like tools. Jade stitched the room together with clips, dropping them into a projector feed. The room gasped, then hummed. "Your camera doesn't blink," Evelyn said, resting a palm on her granddaughter's head like a benediction. "It's the only way I know to make them not look away," Jade said. Evelyn kissed the top of her head. "Baby, you're making us look at ourselves too." That night, when Evelyn turned off the sanctuary lights, the room held a charge like a storm's stillness. She stood in the doorway where she and Miriam had once learned each other. She could feel the city prepping its counterstory, the developer prepping his pitch, the Fed rehearsing neutrality. She could also feel a thread thin bright, running from the girl at the first march to the girl behind the lens now. She followed it toward morning. Trent Wallace arrived at City Hall with a smile that had its own lapel pin. The Jackson Corridor Revitalization slideshow opened with drone footage of the neighborhood at golden hour, as if the sun had been hired. The second slide showed a cafe with seating that assumed winter didn't exist. The third showed a family that looked like stock art shopping for antiques none of their grandparents had owned. Trent's voice laid down words like carpet, public-private partnerships, catalytic investment, mixed use, safety. Evelyn sat in the second row with Miriam to her left and Pastor Ellis to her right. Jade crouched on the aisle, camera low like a cat ready to move. Max stayed near the back. Courthouses and councils tasted alike. "Phase 1 will address blight," Trent said, clicking to a slide labeled Parcel 17 Current Condition. The photo on the screen showed the community center, but from an angle that made it look like an error. The kitchen did not appear. The Wednesday night clinic did not appear. The children's drawings did not appear. The word blight hung like a diagnosis designed to justify a cure that wasn't medicine. Evelyn stood. "Respectfully," she said, and did not wait for permission to continue. "Parcel 17 is a place where children pass the GED and men learn how to come home. Parcel 17 is a kitchen where we feed people who are hungry and policy that is hungrier. Parcel 17 is not blight. It is the light that blight hasn't eaten." Trent smiled his entire dental plan. "We appreciate the community's emotional investment," he said. "We intend to honor your legacy with a commemorative plaque in our mixed-use plaza." Miriam raised an eyebrow so sharp it could have been submitted as evidence. "You intend to displace the legal clinic that kept your eviction numbers down last winter," she said. "You intend to replace slow, hard-won safety with price points and cops." Trent clicked again. "Job creation. Tax base. Retail diversity." He spoke about the dangers of vacant parcels, as if the danger were emptiness and not the hands that made it. He referenced federal grants that required timely action. He introduced a community benefits agreement that promised internships and a mural. Whose community? Jade murmured into her mic. Her camera watched the council members' eyes, tallying blink rates, logging who looked at whom when certain words were said. She live-streamed the scrolling comments from neighbors who watched from double shifts in hospital rooms and kitchen tables. When it was the public's turn, the microphone became a threshing floor. A grandmother said, "My front steps are cracked, not my dignity." A shop owner said, "If you want to help, fix the alley light." A teenager said, "The only thing I need from a plaza is shade and the right to sit down." A nurse said, "Your plan says safety. My son hears stop and frisk." Trent leaned on his elbow and performed patience. He used first names like he was buying something. He promised to work with faith leaders, and glanced toward Pastor Ellis. Pastor Ellis looked at the ceiling as if checking for leaks only he could see. A council member squeezed his pen until it creaked. "We can't stop investment," he said, as if investment were weather. "But we can shape it." He proposed a committee, a hearing, a set of conditions softer than the Baptist choir's crescendos. After, in the rotunda, Trent approached with photographer and pen. "Mrs. Carter," he said, as if her name were a brand he could partner with. "Let's find common ground." Evelyn regarded his shoes, the kind that never saw buses. "Ground is what I stand on," she said. "I found it already." He laughed as if she had done something adorable. "Can we meet? I'll bring my team. You bring yours." "I don't bring teams," Evelyn said. "I bring community." "Perfect," he said, as if that had been his idea. When he walked away, Miriam squinted after him. "He's dangerous," she said, "because he believes himself." "We've fought men who knew they were lying," Evelyn said. "This is a different sport." They circled a date. They planned as if for Storm. The archive did not give up its treasures without flirting. Evelyn and Jade spent 3 days at the county records office inhaling dust and accusations. Jade filmed deeds like landscapes. Evelyn read cursive that had once decided who got to put their body under which roof. They looked for what Trent pretended didn't exist. Paper that proved the center stood on land set aside for community used by a woman whose name had been pushed to the margins. "Who is she?" Jade asked, peering over the counter at a ledger the size of a toddler. "Somebody's auntie who fought meaner men with less PowerPoint," Evelyn said. On the afternoon of Day 3's success, a deed from 1959 that encumbered Parcel 17 with a covenant, for educational, religious, and mutual aid purposes in perpetuity, signed by one Mabeline Booker in a hand that had practiced on hymnals. Evelyn's mouth tasted like futures. Booker. She knew that name with her bone. "Zay's people," she whispered, a weather system building under her breastbone. She made a copy and put the original back as if tucking a baby. Jade leaned against the counter and filmed the copier light slide like a slow tide. "Grandma," she said soft. "This is wow." "It's a thread," Evelyn said. "We'll see where it pulls." The thread tugged a letter loose from the back of a church hymnal, exactly where Ruthie would have hidden something she needed to both keep and find. It had been placed there in 1970 by someone with the same careful touch. Miriam, in the church office, slit the envelope with the butter knife. Evelyn recognized the handwriting before she recognized the voice. "Evie," it began. "By the time you read this, I will have done what a coward calls a sacrifice and what a strategist calls necessary. I have been told I am both." It was Zay. He wrote of choices made under pressure applied in quiet rooms. Meetings where a man asked him questions he thought were jokes. A second meeting where the man knew all the punchlines already. A third where a signature would have bought him safety he didn't want to own. "I did not sign," he wrote. "But I did disappear so I wouldn't be signed. I am sorry for the shape of that absence. If you hate me in full. Do not let them write the story of me with their shorthand." At the bottom, a postscript crooked enough to make Evelyn cry. "My Aunt Mabeline says she deeded the center to forever. If ever you need the paper, look where the altos sit and the altos hide things." Evelyn laughed then, because the altos had always been thieves for the Lord. She laughed and cried and pressed the letter to her nose and smelled decades. She carried both deed and letter to Ruthie's kitchen like offerings. Ruthie read in silence, lips moving. When she finished, she tapped the deed. "God bless Mabeline's stubborn soul," she said. Then she tapped the letter. "And God bless that boy's legs for running. Not every fight is won by staying." Evelyn ran a finger along the crease where Zay had folded his apology. Forgiveness arrived not like a flood but like a faucet you have to jiggle. It dripped steady enough to drink from. Miriam filed the deed with emotion that had the tone of a woman who knows where the bodies are buried and has the shovel. "You want to build.